The screams that tore through the night air on Bakery Street would haunt the neighborhood forever. Amara's skin was still smoking when she stumbled out of her house at 2 in the morning, her nightgown clinging to the burns that covered her arms, neck, and part of her face. The kettle lay shattered on the kitchen floor inside, and her husband Kofi stood frozen in the doorway, his hands trembling as neighbors began pouring out of their homes. But what happened next, what Amara did in that moment of unimaginable pain, would set off a chain of events that nobody, least of all Kofi, could have predicted. As Mrs. Adeyemi from next door rushed toward her with a blanket, Amara did something that made everyone stop in their tracks. She pulled out her phone, opened her camera, and with tears streaming down her face, she began to record. "My name is Amara Johnson," she said, her voice steady despite the agony written across her features. "And I want the world to see what love turned into." The video would be watched by 17 million people within 48 hours. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. To understand how a respected teacher named Kofi Johnson became the most hated man in 3 states, we need to go back to where it all began. 6 years earlier, Amara had met Kofi at her cousin Thandai's wedding in Atlanta. He was a friend of the groom, working as an accountant for a mid-sized firm downtown. Kofi was the kind of man mothers approved of. Well-dressed, articulate, ambitious, with a smile that could light up a room. He quoted Maya Angelou, "Open doors," and called his own mother every Sunday without fail. Their courtship was the kind that made friends jealous. Kofi would send flowers to Amara's classroom where she taught 5th grade, always with notes that made her students giggle and call him Mr. Romantic. He learned to cook her favorite dish, jollof rice with extra peppers, just the way her grandmother used to make it. When he proposed at Stone Mountain Park during a family picnic, even Amara's usually stern father had tears in his eyes. The wedding was everything Amara had dreamed of. Her students formed a guard of honor outside the church. Kofi's family had flown in from Ghana, bringing with them the rich traditions that made the celebration feel like a bridge between 2 worlds. In her white dress, with African print accents that honored both their heritages, Amara felt like the luckiest woman alive. The first year of marriage was good. They bought a modest 3-bedroom house in a quiet neighborhood where children played basketball in the streets and everyone knew everyone's name. Amara continued teaching, inspiring young minds with the same passion that had made her Teacher of the Year. Kofi climbed the ladder at his firm, bringing home stories of successful audits and impressed clients. But somewhere in the 2nd year, something began to shift. Kofi started coming home later, his mood darker. He'd pour himself a drink before dinner, then another, then another. Amara would try to talk to him about his day, but he'd brush her off, his responses growing shorter and sharper. "You wouldn't understand," he'd say. "You deal with children. I deal with the real world." The first time he raised his voice at her was over something trivial, a forgotten dry cleaning pickup. Amara had been shocked into silence, watching this stranger inhabit her husband's body. He'd apologized profusely the next day, bringing her roses and promising it would never happen again. But it did happen again. And again. The verbal attacks became more frequent, more cutting. He criticized her cooking, her appearance, her dedication to her job. "Maybe if you spent less time with other people's children and more time taking care of your husband," he'd snap, "things would be different around here." Amara tried everything. She suggested counseling, but Kofi refused. She reached out to his family, but they dismissed her concerns with platitudes about marriage requiring patience. Her own mother, shaped by a different generation's understanding of matrimony, advised her to pray more and complain less. The isolation crept in slowly. Kofi didn't like her spending time with friends. He questioned every phone call, every text message. He controlled the finances, giving her an allowance, despite her own salary being deposited into their joint account. When Amara's best friend Zainab tried to intervene, Kofi banned her from their house. "She's trying to poison you against me," he'd insisted. "She's jealous of what we have." The physical violence started on a rainy Tuesday in October. Amara had gotten home late from a parent-teacher conference. Dinner wasn't ready. Kofi had been drinking. The slap came so fast, she didn't have time to process it until she felt the stings spreading across her cheek. He cried that night, holding her, begging forgiveness. "I'm under so much pressure at work," he sobbed. "I don't know what came over me. I love you so much. Please, please forgive me." And because Amara still remembered the man who had quoted poetry and cooked jollof rice, because she had promised before God and family to love him in sickness and in health, because she believed people could change, she forgave him. That forgiveness would cost her more than she could have imagined. The violence became a pattern, always followed by apologies, always blamed on external stress. A shove here, a grab there, marks that could be hidden under long sleeves and carefully applied makeup. Amara became an expert at explaining away bruises. Then came the night that changed everything. The night of the hot water. The night that would make millions of people ask one simple question: how could a human being do this to someone they claim to love? But before we get to that moment, before we see what Amara's next move would be, you need to understand one more thing. Hidden in the back of her closet, beneath a stack of old teaching materials, Amara had been keeping a journal. Page after page of documentation. Dates. Photographs. Medical reports from visits to urgent care centers across 3 counties, each time claiming a different accident. She had been preparing, and Kofi had no idea what was coming. If you're watching this and you've ever known someone in a situation like Amara's, hit that subscribe button right now. This story needs to be heard. And make sure you like this video because what happens next will shock you to your core. Trust me, you won't want to miss a single moment of what Amara does next. The argument that final night had started over something absurdly mundane, a phone charger. Kofi couldn't find his, and in his mind, that was somehow Amara's fault. Never mind that she had been grading papers in the living room all evening while he watched basketball in the bedroom. Never mind that he was a grown man capable of keeping track of his own belongings. "You moved it," he accused, his words slurred from the whiskey he'd been drinking since he got home. "You're always moving my things, making me look stupid." Amara had learned over the years which battles to fight and which to surrender. "I'll help you look for it," she offered quietly, setting down her red pen. But that night, her calm only seemed to enrage him more. He wanted to fight. He needed someone to absorb the anger that had been building in him all day after his boss had passed him over for a promotion that went to a younger colleague. "You don't even care," he spat, advancing toward her. "You just sit there with your stupid papers, pretending to be so important. You think you're better than me, don't you? Kofi, please. Let's not do this tonight. I have an early meeting tomorrow with a student's parents." There you go again. Always thinking about those kids. What about me? What about what I need? Amara stood up, gathering her papers. She had learned to recognize the point of no return, the moment when the only safe option was to remove herself from his presence. "I'm going to sleep in the guest room tonight. We can talk in the morning when you're feeling better." That's when his hand shot out and grabbed her wrist, hard enough that she knew it would leave marks. "You're not going anywhere. I'm talking to you." For years, Amara had absorbed his anger. She had made herself small, quiet, accommodating. She had excused and forgiven and prayed. But something in her that night, some final thread of self-preservation, snapped. "Let go of me," she said, her voice firm. The shock in Kofi's eyes lasted only a second before it transformed into rage. He released her wrist and shoved her backward. She stumbled but caught herself against the arm of the couch. "Don't you ever talk to me like that," he growled. "This is my house. You live here because I allow it." Amara could have backed down. She could have apologized, smoothed things over, played the role she had perfected over for years. But she was tired. So achingly tired. "This is our house, Kofi. I pay bills too. I have just as much right to be here as you do." What happened next would be burned into her memory forever. Kofi's face contorted into something she barely recognized. He turned and walked toward the kitchen without a word. Amara heard the sound of the kettle being filled, heard the click of the stove igniting. She should have run then. Some instinct screamed at her to grab her keys and leave. But part of her couldn't believe, even after everything, that he would actually hurt her. Not really hurt her. When Kofi returned carrying the kettle, steam rising from its spout, Amara's brain refused to process what she was seeing. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice suddenly small. Teaching you a lesson about respect, he said, and there was something cold and calculated in his tone that was somehow worse than the rage. The hot water hit her left shoulder first. The pain was beyond anything she had ever experienced, beyond anything she had words for. Her skin felt like it was being peeled away. She screamed and tried to run, but Kofi followed, pouring more of the scalding water onto her arm, her neck, splashing her face. The kettle was finally empty. Kofi stood there, chest heaving, staring at what he had done. For a moment, clarity seemed to dawn in his eyes. Horror. Realization. But it was too late. Amara's survival instinct kicked in. Through the blinding pain, through the shock, she knew she had one chance. One moment before Kofi tried to contain this, to explain it away, to convince her it wasn't as bad as it seemed. She ran for the front door, fumbling with the lock with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. Behind her, she heard Kofi say, "Amara, wait. Let me help you. We need to put something on those burns." But she was already outside, already screaming for help, already pulling out her phone with trembling fingers that somehow remembered how to work the camera app. Mrs. Adeyemi from next door was the first to reach her, and the elderly woman's face went pale at the sight. "Sweet Jesus," she whispered. "Who did this to you?" Behind them, Kofi appeared in the doorway. "She had an accident," he started to say. "The kettle slipped and I did this," Amara interrupted, her voice cutting through the night air with startling clarity. She held up her phone, recording everything. "I'm recording this." Kofi Johnson poured boiling water on me. "My husband did this to me on purpose." More neighbors were gathering now. Mr. Thompson from across the street. The young couple from 2 doors down. The Okonkwo family with their teenage sons who had frozen on their front porch. "Amara, stop," Kofi pleaded, but there was panic in his voice now. "You're in shock. You don't know what you're saying. It was an accident. Tell them about the black eye you gave me in March," Amara said into her camera, tears streaming down her face, but her voice unwavering. "Tell them about the time you choked me until I saw stars. Tell them about the bruises I've been hiding for 4 years." Someone had called 911. In the distance, sirens were approaching. Kofi's face cycled through emotions: fear, anger, desperation, calculation. "She's lying," he said to the gathered neighbors. "She's having some kind of breakdown. I would never hurt my wife. You all know me. You've seen us together. Have I ever been anything but good to her?" And that's when Amara played her trump card. With her free hand, still filming with the other, she called up a file on her phone. A folder she had titled Evidence. Dozens of photos. Dated. Time-stamped. Burns, bruises, cuts. Medical reports from clinics across the county, each one documenting injuries she had claimed were accidents. "I've been documenting everything for 2 years," she said to the camera. "Every hit, every threat, every time he made me feel like I was nothing. I stayed because I believed he would change. I stayed because I was ashamed. I stayed because everyone told me that's what you do in a marriage. But I was also planning, waiting for the right moment to show the world who Kofi Johnson really is." The ambulance arrived, followed closely by 2 police cars. Paramedics rushed to Amara's side, their faces grim as they assessed her burns. Police officers approached Kofi, who was still insisting it had all been a terrible accident, that his wife was confused from the pain. But Amara had already posted the video. It had already been shared by Mrs. Adeyemi's daughter, who had been filming on her own phone from her mother's porch. By the time Kofi was being handcuffed, his face was already spreading across social media, accompanied by Amara's steady, damning testimony. As they loaded her into the ambulance, Amara looked back at the house where she had tried so hard to build a life. Kofi stood in handcuffs, still trying to explain, still trying to control the narrative. But the narrative was no longer his to control. And what would happen over the next 48 hours would ensure that Kofi Johnson's name became synonymous with something he had never anticipated: accountability. Before we go on with what happens next, I want to ask you something. Where are you watching this from? Drop your location in the comments below. This story is reaching people all over the world, and it's important that we all understand domestic violence has no borders, no boundaries. It happens everywhere, in every community. So, let us know where you're from, and remember to hit that like button if this story is touching your heart. The video went viral within hours. By the time Amara was being treated in the emergency room, her face and testimony had been shared across Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. The hashtag Justice for Amara was trending before sunrise. What made the video so powerful wasn't just the visible burns or Amara's raw pain. It was her composure, her clarity, the way she stood there, injured and traumatized, yet strong enough to ensure the truth would be documented. People couldn't look away. At Grady Memorial Hospital, nurses and doctors moved around Amara with a mixture of professional efficiency and barely concealed emotion. The burns covered approximately 20% of her body, mostly second degree, with some areas verging on third degree. The attending physician, Dr. Kemi Oladipo, had to step out of the room for a moment to compose herself after seeing the extent of the injuries. "Mrs. Johnson," Dr. Oladipo said gently when she returned, "we're going to take care of you. But I need you to know that I'm required by law to report this to the authorities." "They already know," Amara whispered through the pain medication beginning to take effect. "The whole world knows now." Indeed they did. In the waiting room, hospital security was already dealing with reporters who had somehow learned which hospital Amara had been taken to. News vans were setting up in the parking lot. Amara's phone, which the nurses had placed in a plastic bag with her other belongings, hadn't stopped buzzing with notifications. Meanwhile, at the DeKalb County Police Station, Kofi Johnson was experiencing his own nightmare. The booking process that he had only seen on television was now his reality. Fingerprints, mugshot, the removal of his belt and shoelaces, the small concrete cell that smelled of desperation and disinfectant. But worse than the physical reality of jail was what was happening outside. His phone had been confiscated, so he had no idea that his face was being broadcast across every major news network. He didn't know that his employer, Morrison & Associates accounting firm, had already released a statement placing him on indefinite, unpaid leave pending investigation. He didn't know that his name was being spoken with disgust in living rooms across America. What he did know, as he sat on that hard bench, was that he had made a terrible mistake. Not a moral awakening about years of abuse, but a tactical error. He should have been more careful. Should have taken her phone. Should have prevented her from recording. In his mind, even now, he was the victim of his own poor planning rather than the perpetrator of a heinous crime. Back at the hospital, Amara's room had become a fortress. Her friend Zainab had arrived, tears streaming down her face as she was finally allowed to see what Kofi had been hiding from everyone. Amara's mother, Grace, had driven through the night from Birmingham, her face carved from stone as she held her daughter's unburned hand. "Baby," Grace whispered, "I'm so sorry. I should have listened. I should have known." "You couldn't have known, Mama," Amara replied, her voice hoarse from screaming. "He was good at hiding it. We both were." Zainab pulled up a chair on the other side of the bed. "Girl, your video has 17 million views and counting. The entire internet is on your side. There are already people organizing protests outside the jail. They're calling for maximum sentencing." Amara closed her eyes. She hadn't posted that video for revenge or internet fame. She had posted it for survival, for documentation, for the truth. But now that truth had taken on a life of its own. By morning, the story had exploded further. National news anchors were discussing it. Domestic violence advocates were using Amara's case as a rallying point. Celebrities were sharing the video with messages of support. The governor of Georgia had even released a statement condemning domestic violence and promising that justice would be served. But it was the response from everyday people that truly showed how deeply the story had resonated. Women from around the country began sharing their own stories in the comments of Amara's video. Thousands of them. Stories of abuse hidden behind smiling family photos. Stories of violence dismissed by family and friends. Stories of survival and escape and recovery. "I was Amara 5 years ago," wrote one woman. Except I didn't have the courage to record it. I didn't have proof. He got away with it. Thank you for being brave enough to show the world the truth. Another commented, my sister died at the hands of her husband 3 months ago. Everyone said he was such a good man. No one believed us when we tried to tell them what he was doing to her. I wish she had been as strong as Amara. The comment section became a virtual support group, a testimony to how common and how hidden domestic violence truly was. People weren't just watching Amara's story. They were seeing their own stories, their mother's stories, their sister's stories reflected back at them. Kofi's first court appearance was scheduled for Monday morning. It was only Saturday. His lawyer, a public defender named Marcus Webb, who had drawn the short straw that weekend, came to see him in the holding cell. Mr. Johnson, Webb said, sitting across from Kofi in the small interview room, I'm going to be straight with you. This case is about as bad as it gets. There's video evidence. There are witnesses. And the public sentiment against you is unlike anything I've seen in my 15 years of practice. It wasn't supposed to go this far, Kofi muttered. She just wouldn't stop talking back. She wouldn't listen. I only wanted to scare her a little, to make her understand that I'm the man of the house. Webb's expression didn't change, but his pen paused over his notepad. Mr. Johnson, I strongly advise you not to say things like that. To anyone. Ever. Do you understand? But it's the truth. My father kept my mother in line, and they were married for 40 years. Happy years. This generation of women, they don't understand respect. Webb closed his notepad. Sir, with all due respect, I'm here to defend you legally, not to enable your worldview. Right now, you're being charged with aggravated assault and domestic violence. Given the severity of your wife's injuries and the premeditated nature of the act, as evidenced by you heating up water before attacking her, you're looking at 5 to 20 years if convicted. For the first time, the reality seemed to penetrate Kofi's defenses. 20 years? For disciplining my own wife. For pouring boiling water on another human being, Webb corrected sharply. And I suggest you stop referring to it as discipline unless you want to ensure you get the maximum sentence. Outside the police station, the protest Zainab had mentioned was growing. What had started as a few dozen people on Saturday morning had swelled to hundreds by afternoon. They carried signs reading, Believe survivors, Amara's courage saves lives, and no more excuses for abusers. News crews interviewed protesters. Young women, old women, men, teenagers, entire families stood in solidarity. One elderly woman held a sign that read, I survived 30 years of abuse in silence. Not anymore. A journalist approached her. Ma'am, can you tell us why you're here today? The woman's weathered face was streaked with tears. Because when I was going through what Amara went through, nobody believed me. My own family told me to be quiet, to pray, to be a better wife. I lived in hell for 30 years before I finally left. And even then, people judged me for breaking up my marriage. But this young woman, she stood up for herself. She showed the world the truth. She's a hero. At the hospital, Amara was watching some of the news coverage on the television in her room. She felt numb, disconnected from the person on the screen that everyone was talking about. The pain medication helped with her physical wounds, but her emotional state was more complex than anyone could imagine. She wasn't just angry or hurt or traumatized, though she was all those things. She was also grieving. Grieving for the man she thought Kofi was when they first met. Grieving for the marriage she had wanted to have. Grieving for the 4 years she had lost trying to fix something that was never hers to fix. You did the right thing, her mother said, reading her daughter's expression. I know you're hurting in ways that go beyond these burns. But baby, you saved your own life last night. Amara nodded slowly. I know, Mama. I just wish I had done it sooner. What would you have done in Amara's situation? Would you have stayed as long as she did, hoping things would change? Or would you have left at the first sign of violence? Drop your thoughts in the comments below because these are questions every survivor faces and there's no easy answer. And if this story is making you think differently about domestic violence, go ahead and share this video. Someone in your life might need to see it. Someone might need to know they're not alone. By Sunday afternoon, Kofi's family had arrived in Atlanta. His mother, Abina, his two brothers, Kwame and Ya, and his sister, Efua, gathered in a hotel conference room with Marcus Webb to discuss strategy. The family was in shock, unable or unwilling to reconcile the monster in that viral video with the Kofi they thought they knew. There must be some explanation, Abina insisted, her accent thick with emotion and her Ghanaian heritage. My son is not this person. He was raised to respect women. His father never laid a hand on me. Webb shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Mrs. Johnson, I understand this is difficult to accept, but the evidence is overwhelming. The video shows a moment of anger, Kwame interrupted. A terrible moment, yes, but one moment. What about the 4 years before that? What about all the times he was good to her? Abuse doesn't work that way, Webb explained patiently. The pattern your brother established is textbook. Periods of kindness followed by escalating violence. The good moments don't erase the bad ones. They're actually part of the cycle that keeps victims trapped. Efua, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. I want to see her. I want to talk to Amara. That's not advisable, Webb said quickly. Any contact with the victim could be seen as intimidation or an attempt to influence her testimony. I'm not going to intimidate her, Efua snapped. I want to hear her side. I want to understand what my brother allegedly did. There's no allegedly about it, Webb said firmly. It's on video. 17 million people have seen it. Your brother admitted to me that he did it, though he tried to justify it as discipline. Mrs. Johnson, all of you need to understand that this isn't a case we can win by proving innocence. The best we can hope for is a plea deal that gets him less than the maximum sentence. The room fell silent as the weight of those words settled over them. This was real. This was happening. Their beloved Kofi, the successful accountant, the dutiful son, was going to prison. At the hospital, Amara was receiving visitors of a different kind. Representatives from 3 different domestic violence organizations had reached out, offering support, resources, and protection if she needed it. A prominent civil rights attorney named Sharon Mitchell had offered to represent her pro bono in any related legal matters. You don't have to face this alone, Sharon said, sitting beside Amara's bed. She was an imposing woman in her 50s with silver-streaked locks and a reputation for winning impossible cases. What you did by recording and posting that video was incredibly brave. But now comes the hard part. The trial, the media scrutiny, the people who will try to tear you down. People are already trying to tear me down, Amara said quietly. She had made the mistake of reading some of the comments on social media. While most were supportive, there was a vocal minority blaming her for provoking Kofi, questioning why she stayed so long, suggesting she wanted attention or money. Those people will always exist, Sharon acknowledged. But they're in the minority, and they're wrong. You're a survivor, Amara, and you're going to get through this. But you need to be prepared for what's coming. What was coming turned out to be more than anyone anticipated. On Monday morning, Kofi's arraignment became a media circus. The courthouse was surrounded by protesters, supporters, journalists, and curious onlookers. Police had to create barriers to ensure order. Inside the courtroom, Judge Patricia Williams presided with stern efficiency. She had reviewed the evidence, watched the viral video, and read the preliminary police reports. When Kofi was brought in wearing an orange jumpsuit, the courtroom erupted in whispers. He looked diminished somehow. The confident man who had once commanded respect at Morrison and Associates now shuffled forward with his head down, avoiding the cameras and the angry faces in the gallery. Mr. Johnson, Judge Williams began once order was restored. You're being charged with aggravated assault, aggravated battery, and family violence. How do you plead? Marcus Webb stood. Not guilty, Your Honor. The courtroom exploded again. People shouted. Someone yelled. We saw the video. He's guilty. Judge Williams banged her gavel. Order. I will have order in this courtroom, or I will clear it. The prosecution, led by Assistant District Attorney James Crawford, argued passionately against bail. Your Honor, the defendant committed a heinous act of violence against his wife in their own home. The premeditated nature of the attack, evidenced by him heating water before using it as a weapon, combined with the severity of the victim's injuries and the massive public attention this case has received, makes him a flight risk and a danger to the victim. Webb countered with his own arguments about Kofi's ties to the community, his lack of prior criminal record, his steady employment history. But even as he spoke, he knew it was a losing battle. Judge Williams took less than 5 minutes to deliberate. Bail is denied. Mr. Johnson, you will remain in custody until trial. Given the nature of the charges and the evidence I've reviewed, I'm also issuing a permanent restraining order prohibiting you from any contact, direct or indirect, with the victim. Trial is set for March 15th. Next case. Just like that, it was over. Kofi was led away, back to his cell, while outside the courthouse, protesters cheered the decision. News anchors delivered breaking news updates. Social media erupted with commentary. At the hospital, Amara watched the coverage with mixed emotions. Part of her felt vindicated. Another part felt hollow. This man she had once loved, had promised to spend her life with, was now a stranger facing years in prison. She didn't regret exposing him. She just wished none of it had been necessary in the first place. Her students at Oakwood Elementary had created a massive get well card, signed by all 127 fifth graders and many of their parents. The card was covered in hearts, rainbows, and messages like, "You're the bravest person I know," and "Thank you for teaching us to stand up for ourselves." Reading those messages made Amara cry harder than she had since the night of the attack. These children, these beautiful, innocent children, were learning a lesson she had never intended to teach. They were learning that sometimes the people who are supposed to love you can hurt you, but they were also learning that you don't have to stay silent, that you can fight back, that the truth matters. Her principal, Dr. Robert Hayes, had visited earlier that day with flowers and a promise that her job would be waiting whenever she was ready to return. "The parents have been calling non-stop," he told her. "Everyone wants you to know that they support you. Some of them have shared their own stories with me, things I never knew about. Amara, what you've done has opened up conversations that needed to happen." By Monday evening, the story had reached international news. CNN, BBC, Al Jazeera, all the major networks were covering it. Amara's video had been translated into multiple languages. Domestic violence hotlines around the world reported a surge in calls from people finally finding the courage to seek help. A woman in Lagos, Nigeria, recorded her own video after seeing Amara's, exposing her abusive husband. Another in Mumbai, India, did the same. Amara's courage had sparked a movement, a global conversation about violence that happened behind closed doors. But movements come with backlash. By Tuesday, a counter-narrative began emerging online. Men's rights groups started claiming Amara was weaponizing victimhood. Anonymous accounts began digging into her past, looking for anything to discredit her. They found a photo from college where she was holding a beer at a party. They found a speeding ticket from 2019. They twisted innocent moments into evidence of poor character. "You need to stop reading the comments," Zainab insisted, gently taking Amara's phone away. "These people are just noise. They don't matter." "But what if they're right?" Amara whispered. "What if I could have prevented all this by being a better wife?" "Stop it," Zainab said firmly. "You're a survivor, not a perpetrator. Nothing you did or didn't do justified what he did to you. Nothing." Sharon Mitchell arrived with news. Kofi's family is trying to negotiate a plea deal. They want him to plead guilty to a lesser charge in exchange for a reduced sentence. The DA wants to know if you'd be willing to provide a victim impact statement. Amara looked down at her bandaged arms. The burns were beginning to heal, but the scars would be permanent. Visible reminders of the night her life changed forever. "Yes," she said finally. "I want to speak. I want him to hear what he did to me. Not just the physical pain, but everything else. I want it on record." What happened next would determine not just Kofi's fate, but would set a precedent for how domestic violence cases would be handled in Georgia and potentially across the country. Amara's voice, which had been silenced for so long, was about to become impossible to ignore. The trial was still 2 months away, but the real battle had only just begun. The weeks following Kofi's arraignment brought unexpected challenges. Amara was discharged from the hospital after 10 days, her burns healing but leaving behind scars that mapped the violence across her skin like a permanent testimony. She moved in temporarily with her mother in Birmingham, unable to face returning to the house on Bakery Street where her marriage had died in flames and screaming. The physical recovery was painful but predictable. The emotional recovery was something else entirely. Amara found herself jumping at sudden sounds. She couldn't stand near the stove without her hands trembling. At night, she dreamed of boiling water and woke up gasping, checking her arms to make sure the burns weren't fresh. It's called post-traumatic stress, the therapist explained during one of their sessions. Dr. Lisa Chen specialized in trauma survivors and had been recommended by the Domestic Violence Advocacy Group. Your body remembers the trauma even when your mind tries to move forward. Healing isn't linear, Amara. Some days will be harder than others. Meanwhile, the media coverage continued relentlessly. Every development in the case made headlines. When Morrison and Associates officially terminated Kofi's employment, it was news. When his professional accounting license was suspended pending the outcome of the trial, it was news. When 3 of his former colleagues came forward with stories about his temper and controlling behavior at work, it was definitely news. He once threw a stapler across the office when a junior accountant made a mistake on a spreadsheet, revealed Patricia Holmes, who had worked in the same department. We all laughed it off as stress, but looking back now, the signs were there. He had anger issues. He just hid them well from most people. But the most damaging revelation came from an unexpected source. Kofi's ex-girlfriend from before he met Amara, a woman named Jasmine Brooks, contacted Sharon Mitchell's office with a story she had kept buried for 7 years. "He hit me too," Jasmine said in a recorded statement that would later be submitted as evidence of a pattern of behavior. "We dated for about 8 months. At first, he was wonderful, just like everyone says. But then he started getting possessive, controlling. He wanted to know where I was every minute, who I talked to, what I wore. When I tried to break up with him, he grabbed me by the throat and slammed me against a wall. He told me that if I left him, he'd make sure everyone knew I was a liar and a troublemaker." Jasmine had never reported the incident. She had been too scared, too ashamed, too worried that no one would believe her. But watching Amara's courage inspired her to finally speak up. "I've been carrying this guilt for 7 years," Jasmine said during a televised interview that sent shockwaves through the case. "Wondering if I had spoken up back then, maybe Amara wouldn't have gone through what she did. Maybe she wouldn't have these scars. I have to live with that." The prosecution was ecstatic. This evidence of prior abuse strengthened their case exponentially. It showed that Kofi's violence wasn't a one-time incident born of unusual stress, but a pattern that predated his marriage to Amara. In his cell, Kofi watched Jasmine's interview on the small television mounted to the wall. His face cycled through emotions, surprise, anger, and finally, something resembling fear. The walls were closing in, and the narrative he had tried to construct about being a good man who made one terrible mistake was crumbling. His family remained divided. His mother, Abina, steadfastly maintained her son's innocence despite all evidence. "These women are conspiring against him," she insisted to anyone who would listen. "They are jealous of his success. This is a plot to destroy a good African man." But his sister Efua had done something her mother considered unforgivable. She had reached out to Amara through Sharon Mitchell, asking permission to visit. After much deliberation, and with her lawyer present, Amara agreed to meet. The meeting took place in Sharon's office, neutral territory, with security nearby. Efua arrived looking exhausted, her eyes red from crying. She sat across from Amara, taking in the visible scars on her former sister-in-law's arms and neck. "I don't expect you to forgive me," Efua began, her voice shaking. "I should have seen it. I should have known. There were signs, weren't there? Times when you seemed withdrawn or made excuses about bruises. I chose not to see them because he's my brother, and I didn't want to believe he could be that person." Amara listened quietly, her face unreadable. "I came here to tell you that I believe you," Efua continued. "I believe every word. And I want you to know that not all of Kofi's family is standing behind him. My mother might be, but I can't. What he did is unforgivable. You were brave to expose him, and I'm so sorry you had to go through this alone for so long. Why are you here? Amara asked finally. Really? Efua took a deep breath. Because I have a daughter. She's 12. And I realized that if I teach her to excuse men's violence because they're family, because they're under stress, because they're usually good people, then I'm setting her up to become a victim someday. I came here to tell you that you broke a cycle. Not just for yourself, but for women like my daughter, who need to see that abuse is never acceptable. Never justified. Never something to hide. The two women talked for over an hour. It wasn't forgiveness, exactly, but it was understanding. It was the beginning of Efua reckoning with the uncomfortable truth that you can love someone and still hold them accountable for their actions. As February turned into March, the prosecution and defense both prepared for trial. Marcus Webb had tried multiple times to negotiate a plea deal, but the DA's office was firm. Given the severity of the crime, the video evidence, and the public interest in the case, they wanted this to go to trial. They wanted justice to be seen being served. Amara spent her days in therapy, slowly rebuilding her sense of self. She started writing again, not just in her journal, but working on a memoir about her experience. A major publishing house had reached out with an offer, seeing the potential in her story to help other survivors. I want to write it, she told Sharon, but I'm scared. Scared of reliving it all. Scared of what people will say. Scared that Kofi's lawyers will use it against me somehow. They might try, Sharon acknowledged. But your story deserves to be told in your own words, not just through news clips and court transcripts. You get to control your narrative, Amara. That's power he can never take from you again. The trial date was now just 2 weeks away. Jury selection would begin on March 1st, with opening statements scheduled for March 15th. The prosecution had a strong case. The video, witness testimony, medical records, Jasmine's testimony about prior abuse, and Amara's documented evidence from the journal she had kept. But trials were unpredictable. Webb might not be able to prove innocence, but he could try to create doubt about intent, to paint Kofi as a man who lost control rather than a habitual abuser. He could try to make the jury sympathize with a man who threw away his life in one moment of rage. The question was, would it work? On the last Sunday before jury selection began, Amara did something she hadn't done since the night of the attack. She went to church. Her mother's church in Birmingham, where people knew her as Grace's daughter rather than the woman from the viral video. The pastor's sermon that morning seemed almost prophetic. He spoke about courage, about standing in your truth even when the world tries to silence you, about the difference between forgiveness and accountability. Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, Pastor Williams preached. It doesn't mean pretending wrong wasn't done. It means releasing the poison of hatred from your own heart while still demanding justice. You can forgive someone and still require them to face consequences for their actions. That's not vengeance. That's wisdom. Amara felt those words settle into her bones. She had been struggling with the concept of forgiveness, feeling guilty for the anger she still carried toward Kofi. But Pastor Williams was right. She could forgive him for her own peace, while still expecting him to answer for what he did. After the service, several women approached her. Older women, younger women, women who saw themselves in her story. "Thank you for speaking up," one grandmother told her, gripping her hand tightly. "My granddaughter is in a bad situation right now. She won't leave him, but I showed her your video, and I saw something shift in her eyes. You planted a seed. You showed her that staying isn't the only option." These encounters reminded Amara why she had posted that video in the first place. Not for revenge or fame, but for truth. For other women who needed to see that survival was possible, that speaking up was possible, that justice, however imperfect, was worth fighting for. This story isn't just about one woman and one man. It's about a system that often fails domestic violence survivors, about a culture that tells women to be quiet and forgiving, about the courage it takes to break that silence. If you know someone who might be in an abusive relationship, share this video. Let them know they're not alone. And hit that subscribe button because you won't want to miss what happens when this case finally goes to trial. The courtroom confrontation between Amara and Kofi is something you need to see. The DeKalb County Courthouse had never seen anything like it. By 7 in the morning on March 1st, the day jury selection began. Hundreds of people had gathered outside. Some were protesters with signs supporting Amara. Others were domestic violence survivors who had traveled from across the country to witness what they saw as a landmark case. News vans lined the street, their satellite dishes pointed skyward like metal flowers reaching for the sun. Inside, security had been tripled. Every person entering the courthouse had to pass through metal detectors and bag checks. Judge Patricia Williams had issued strict orders. No outbursts, no recording devices, no disruptions of any kind. Anyone who violated these rules would be removed and potentially held in contempt. Amara arrived through a side entrance, flanked by Sharon Mitchell and 2 security guards. She wore a simple navy blue dress with long sleeves that covered most of her scars, though the ones on her neck were still visible. She had debated whether to hide them with makeup or scarves, but Sharon had advised against it. "Let the jury see what he did to you," Sharon had said. "Your scars are evidence. They tell the story your voice might not be able to finish if you get emotional on the stand." The jury selection process took 3 days. The defense tried to eliminate anyone who had seen the viral video or expressed strong opinions about domestic violence on social media. The prosecution tried to eliminate anyone who seemed sympathetic to traditional marriage values or who might blame victims for staying in abusive relationships. By March 3rd, they had their jury, 7 women and 5 men, ranging in age from 24 to 68, representing a cross-section of Atlanta's diverse population. A retired teacher, a mechanic, a nurse, 2 IT professionals, a small business owner, a college student, a construction foreman, an accountant, a librarian, a restaurant manager, and a social worker. These 12 people would decide Kofi Johnson's fate. Opening statements began on March 15th, exactly as scheduled. The courtroom was packed with journalists, advocates, some of Amara's friends and family, and a few of Kofi's relatives, including his sister Efua, who sat on the opposite side from her mother in a silent declaration of where her loyalties lay. Assistant District Attorney James Crawford stood before the jury, his voice measured but powerful. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is not a complicated case. On the night of January 15th, Kofi Johnson deliberately filled a kettle with water, heated it to boiling, carried it into the living room where his wife sat grading papers, and poured that scalding water over her body. He did this because she dared to disagree with him, because she dared to assert that their home belonged to both of them, not just to him, because in his mind, his wife needed to be taught a lesson about obedience." Crawford gestured toward Amara, who sat at the prosecution's table with her hands folded. Mrs. Johnson suffered 2nd and 3rd-degree burns over 20% of her body. She will carry those scars for the rest of her life. But those are just the visible scars. The invisible ones, the trauma, the fear, the violation of trust, those will take even longer to heal, if they ever fully do. He clicked a remote, and a screen behind him showed a still image from Amara's video, her face streaked with tears, burns visible on her skin, her expression a mixture of pain and determination. The defendant wants you to believe this was an accident, an unfortunate moment born of stress and anger. But you will hear testimony from witnesses, medical professionals, and from Mrs. Johnson herself that this was not an isolated incident. This was the culmination of 4 years of escalating abuse. 4 years of control, manipulation, and violence. 4 years of a woman trying desperately to save a marriage while her husband was actively destroying her. Crawford paused, making eye contact with each juror. The defendant didn't lose control that night. He exercised it. He made a choice. He chose to heat that water. He chose to carry it to where his wife sat. He chose to pour it on her. And when she ran outside, burned and terrified, his first instinct wasn't to help her. It was to lie. To tell the neighbors it was an accident. To try to control the narrative just like he had controlled her for 4 years. He sat down, and Marcus Webb rose for the defense. Webb was in an impossible position, and everyone in that courtroom knew it. His strategy became clear within the first few minutes of his opening statement. "Ladies and gentlemen, My client is not a monster. He's a man who made a terrible, terrible mistake. A man who, under extreme stress, did something he will regret for the rest of his life. Kofi Johnson is not on trial for being a perfect husband. He's on trial for a specific act that occurred on a specific night, and we need to examine what led to that moment. Webb walked toward the jury box. You're going to hear the prosecution paint a picture of my client as a calculated, cold-blooded abuser. But I ask you to consider this. If Kofi Johnson was truly the monster they describe, why did his wife stay for 4 years? Why did she continue to live with him, to sleep beside him, to present a happy marriage to the outside world? Sharon Mitchell's jaw clenched. She had warned Amara that the defense would use victim-blaming tactics, but hearing it spoken aloud was still infuriating. The truth, Webb continued, is that the Johnson marriage was complicated, as many marriages are. Yes, there were arguments. Yes, there were moments of conflict. But there were also years of companionship, of shared dreams, of genuine affection. On January 15th, a combination of work stress, alcohol, and a heated argument led to a moment where my client lost control. What he did was wrong, criminally wrong, but it was not the calculated act of a habitual abuser. It was the tragic mistake of a man who had reached his breaking point. Webb sat down, and Judge Williams called for a 15-minute recess. In the hallway, Amara stood with Sharon, her hands shaking slightly. He's going to try to make it seem like this was my fault, Amara said quietly. That I provoked him somehow. He's going to try, Sharon agreed. But that's why we have all the other evidence. Jasmine's testimony, the journal, the medical records from multiple incidents. The jury will see the pattern. They'll see the truth. The afternoon session began with the prosecution's first witness, Mrs. Adeyemi, the neighbor who had been first on the scene that night. She described in vivid detail what she had seen, Amara's burns, her screams, Kofi's attempt to claim it was an accident. But Mrs. Johnson was very clear. Mrs. Adeyemi testified, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. She said, "He did this on purpose. My husband poured hot water on me on purpose. And when I looked at her face, I saw something beyond the pain. I saw determination. Like she had finally decided she wasn't going to let him get away with it anymore." The next witness was Dr. Oladipo, the emergency room physician who had treated Amara. She walked the jury through the extent of the injuries using medical diagrams and photographs that made several jurors visibly uncomfortable. Burns of this severity, distributed in this pattern, are inconsistent with an accidental spill, Dr. Oladipo explained. An accident would typically show splashing, a more random distribution. These burns show someone stood over the victim and deliberately poured hot liquid across specific areas of her body. The pattern is unmistakable. Webb tried to challenge her assessment during cross-examination, suggesting that in the chaos of a domestic dispute, the poor pattern could still have been accidental. But Dr. Oladipo held firm. "I've treated hundreds of burn victims in my 15 years in emergency medicine," she said. "I know the difference between an accident and an assault. This was an assault." By the end of the first day of testimony, the prosecution had established the basic facts of the case. But the most powerful testimony was yet to come. Tomorrow, Amara would take the stand. That evening, Amara sat in her hotel room with Sharon, preparing for what would be the most difficult day of her life since January 15th. "He's going to be in that room," Amara said, staring out the window at the Atlanta skyline. "I haven't seen him face to face since that night. I don't know if I can do this." "You can," Sharon assured her. "You've already done the hardest part. You survived. You spoke up. You stood in your truth. Tomorrow is just about telling that truth one more time, in a room where it will matter most, where it will ensure he faces consequences." Amara turned from the window. "What if the jury doesn't believe me? What if they think I deserved it somehow? Then we appeal, and we keep fighting." "But Amara, I've been doing this for 25 years. I've seen a lot of juries, and I watched those 12 people today. They're paying attention. They're taking notes. They're connecting with the evidence. They're going to believe you because what you're telling them is the truth, and truth has a weight that lies can never match." That night, Amara barely slept. She rehearsed her testimony in her mind, trying to prepare herself for seeing Kofi again, for having to recount the worst moments of her life in front of strangers. But she also thought about all the women who had reached out to her, who had shared their own stories, who had found courage in her courage. She thought about her students at Oakwood Elementary, who had learned from their teacher that silence in the face of injustice was not an option. She thought about Efua's daughter, and all the young girls who needed to see that abuse was never acceptable, never excusable, never something to endure in silence. Tomorrow, she would face her abuser one more time. But this time, she wouldn't be alone and afraid in her own home. This time, she would have the power of truth, the support of thousands, and the backing of a justice system that, for once, seemed willing to actually deliver justice. The next morning would change everything. And the world was watching. The courtroom was absolutely silent as Amara Johnson walked to the witness stand on March 16th. Every eye followed her measured steps, the way her hand trembled slightly as she placed it on the Bible to be sworn in. She wore a gray dress with 3/4 sleeves today, and the scars on her forearms caught the courtroom's fluorescent lighting like tragic jewelry. For the first time since his arrest, Amara looked directly at Kofi. He sat at the defense table in a suit that hung looser on him than it had 2 months ago, his face gaunt from stress and poor sleep. When their eyes met, he looked away first, studying his hands as if they belonged to someone else. James Crawford approached the witness stand with a gentle expression. "Mrs. Johnson, I know this is difficult. We'll take this slowly. Can you start by telling the jury about when you first met Kofi Johnson?" And so Amara began. Her voice was soft at first, barely above a whisper, but it grew stronger as she spoke. She told them about the wedding, about the romance, about the man she thought she was marrying. Several jurors leaned forward, drawn in by the contrast between the fairy tale beginning and what they knew was coming. "When did things start to change?" Crawford asked. "About 18 months into our marriage," Amara said. "Small things at first. He'd criticize my cooking, my clothes, how I spent my time. He wanted to know where I was every moment of the day. If I didn't answer his texts immediately, he'd accuse me of cheating or neglecting him. I thought it was just stress from work. I thought if I tried harder to be a good wife, things would get better." And did they get better? No. They got worse. Amara's voice caught, and she took a sip of water. The verbal abuse escalated. He'd call me stupid, worthless, ungrateful. He said I was lucky to have him because no other man would want me. And I started to believe him. That's what abuse does. It makes you believe the lies. Crawford pulled up images on the screen, time-stamped photos from Amara's phone. A black eye from March 2024. Bruises on her arms from June. A split lip from September. For each one, Amara explained the circumstances, the excuses she had made to hide the truth from family and friends. "Why didn't you leave?" Crawford asked, though he had prepared her for this question. Amara looked at the jury. "Because I loved him. Because I had made vows before God and family. Because he would cry and apologize after each incident, promise it would never happen again. Because my own mother told me that marriage requires sacrifice. Because I was ashamed. Because I thought if I just tried harder, loved him better, was more patient, that the man I married would come back. And because I was scared. Scared of being alone. Scared of failing at marriage. Scared of what he might do if I tried to leave." She paused, gathering strength for what came next. But I was also planning. About 2 years ago, I started documenting everything. Taking photos. Keeping a journal with dates and details. Visiting different urgent care centers so no single doctor would see a pattern. I opened a separate bank account he didn't know about. I was gathering evidence because some part of me knew that one day I might need proof. I might need to save my own life. Crawford walked her through the events of January 15th. The argument over the phone charger. Kofi's drinking. The moment she tried to walk away. His grip on her wrist. And then the kettle. "Tell the jury what happened next," Crawford said gently. Amara's hands gripped the edge of the witness stand. He went to the kitchen. "I heard water running, heard the stove click on. Part of me knew something was wrong, but I couldn't process it. I couldn't believe he would actually. But then he came back carrying the kettle, and I saw his face. It wasn't rage anymore. It was cold, calculated, like he had made a decision. A tear rolled down her cheek, but her voice remained steady. He said, "I'm going to teach you a lesson about respect." And then he poured the water on me. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear people breathing. Several jurors had tears in their eyes. One woman had her hand over her mouth. The pain was like nothing I'd ever felt, Amara continued. Like my skin was being peeled off. I screamed and tried to run, but he followed me, pouring more. My shoulder, my arm, my neck. Some splashed on my face. I thought I was going to die. I thought this was how my life would end, in my own home, at the hands of the man who promised to love me. What did you do next? I ran. I got to the door somehow and ran outside. And that's when I knew this was my moment. If I didn't document this, if I didn't speak up right then, he would find a way to explain it away, to make people doubt me. So even though I was in the worst pain of my life, even though I was terrified and traumatized, I pulled out my phone and I recorded the truth. I recorded my burns. I recorded him lying to the neighbors about what happened. I made sure the world could see what he had done. Crawford nodded. No further questions, Your Honor. Marcus Webb approached for cross-examination, and Amara braced herself. This was the part Sharon had warned her about. Mrs. Johnson, Webb began, his tone respectful but probing, you testified that you loved your husband. Is it fair to say that there were also good times in your marriage? Yes, Amara admitted. There were good times. Abuse isn't constant violence. That's what makes it so hard to leave. There are moments of kindness, of normalcy, that make you hope things will change. But you also testified that you started documenting evidence 2 years ago. Doesn't that suggest you were planning to use this evidence against my client? Perhaps even planning to provoke an incident that would give you grounds for divorce, maybe even a lucrative lawsuit. Sharon stood immediately. Objection, Your Honor. Counsel is accusing the victim of orchestrating her own assault. Sustained, Judge Williams said sharply. Mr. Webb, tread carefully. Webb nodded, but continued. Mrs. Johnson, on the night of January 15th, you admit that you defied your husband's request that you stay and talk. You walked away from him. Isn't it possible that this perceived disrespect, this walking away, triggered a reaction that wasn't premeditated, but rather a momentary loss of control? Amara's eyes flashed. He filled a kettle with water. He heated it on the stove. He carried it from the kitchen to where I was. That's not a momentary loss of control. That's a decision made with every step. And even if it was just a reaction, it was a reaction he's responsible for. I'm not responsible for managing his emotions. I'm not responsible for preventing him from being violent. The only person responsible for what Kofi did is Kofi. Several people in the gallery nodded. One of the jurors, the retired teacher, was openly wiping tears from her eyes. Webb asked a few more questions, trying to poke holes in her timeline, suggesting that maybe some of the documented injuries came from accidents rather than abuse. But Amara held firm, her testimony consistent, her voice growing stronger with each answer. When she was finally dismissed, Amara walked past the defense table without looking at Kofi. But as she passed, she heard him whisper, "Amara, please." She stopped, turned, and looked at him one final time. I hope you get help, Kofi. I really do. But I also hope you understand that what you did was wrong. That it was never about me not being good enough or respectful enough. It was about you choosing violence over love. And that's a choice you have to live with. The prosecution rested their case that afternoon after calling Jasmine Brooks, who testified about her own experience with Kofi's violence 7 years earlier. Her testimony was powerful, establishing a pattern that predated the marriage. The defense called only 3 witnesses: Kofi's mother, who insisted her son was incapable of such cruelty, a former coworker who described him as a great guy, and a psychologist who testified about how workplace stress can lead to uncharacteristic behavior. But none of it could overcome the weight of evidence. The video. the medical testimony, the pattern of abuse, Amara's documentation, the scars that the jury had seen with their own eyes. Kofi chose not to testify in his own defense, likely on Webb's advice. Anything he said would have been torn apart by Crawford's cross-examination. Closing arguments took place on March 20th. Crawford reminded the jury of everything they had heard, painting a picture of calculated abuse culminating in a horrific act of violence. Webb made one last plea for leniency, arguing for conviction on a lesser charge, asking the jury to see his client as a flawed human being rather than a monster. The jury deliberated for 7 hours over 2 days. When they returned on March 22nd, the tension in the courtroom was suffocating. Has the jury reached a verdict? Judge Williams asked. The foreman, the retired teacher, stood. We have, Your Honor. On the charge of aggravated assault, how do you find? Guilty. On the charge of aggravated battery, how do you find? Guilty. On the charge of family violence, how do you find? Guilty. The courtroom erupted. Protesters outside, who had been watching on screens, began cheering. Kofi's mother sobbed. Efua squeezed Amara's hand across the aisle. Amara herself sat perfectly still, feeling the weight of 4 years lift from her shoulders like a physical thing. Sentencing was scheduled for April 15th. Webb immediately filed notice of appeal, but everyone knew it was a formality. The evidence had been overwhelming. The verdict just. At the sentencing hearing 3 weeks later, Amara delivered her victim impact statement. She spoke for 20 minutes about the lasting effects of Kofi's abuse, the nightmares, the fear, the physical scars, the shattered trust. But she also spoke about hope, about healing, about the thousands of women who had reached out to share their own stories. What Kofi did to me was horrific, she concluded. But what I did in response, speaking up, showing the world the truth, that's powerful. I hope my story gives other survivors the courage to speak, to document, to refuse to suffer in silence. Because silence protects abusers. Truth holds them accountable. Judge Williams sentenced Kofi Johnson to 18 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 12. It was less than the maximum, but more than the minimum. A sentence that said clearly, domestic violence will not be tolerated. Abusers will face consequences. As Kofi was led away in handcuffs, he looked at Amara one last time. Whether he felt genuine remorse or just regret at being caught, she would never know. And honestly, it no longer mattered. Outside the courthouse, Amara stood before a sea of cameras and microphones. Sharon Mitchell stood beside her, along with representatives from 3 domestic violence organizations. Today, justice was served, Amara said, her voice carrying across the crowd. But justice for me isn't enough. There are millions of women and men trapped in abusive relationships right now. They're reading this story, watching this trial, wondering if they should speak up. And I want to tell them, yes, speak up. Document everything. Reach out for help. You don't have to suffer alone. You don't have to protect your abuser. Your life matters. Your safety matters. And there are people who will believe you and help you. The crowd applauded. Women held up signs reading, I am Amara and survivors speak. 6 months later, Amara had returned to teaching at Oakwood Elementary. Her memoir, Burning Truth, How I Escaped Domestic Violence and Found My Voice, became a bestseller. She started a nonprofit organization providing resources and support for domestic violence survivors, funded by proceeds from the book. She still had scars, both visible and invisible. She still had nightmares sometimes. But she also had her freedom, her voice, and the knowledge that by refusing to stay silent, she had helped countless others find their own courage. Kofi Johnson would spend the next 12 to 18 years behind bars, a convicted felon whose name had become synonymous with domestic abuse. His accounting career was over, his reputation destroyed, his freedom gone. But more importantly, Amara Johnson had her life back. Not the life she had planned when she walked down that aisle in her wedding dress, but a life nonetheless. A life built on truth, courage, and the refusal to let violence have the last word. And that, in the end, was the most powerful revenge of all, surviving, thriving, and using her story to light the way for others walking through their own darkness. What would you have done in Amara's situation? Have you, or someone you know, faced similar challenges? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if this story touched your heart or opened your eyes, please share it with others. Someone in your life might need to see it. Someone might need to know they're not alone, that speaking up is possible, and that justice, however imperfect, is worth fighting for. Subscribe to this channel for more stories that matter, stories that shine light on important issues, stories that might just save someone's life. Because that's what Amara's courage did. It saved lives. And it continues to save lives every day as her story reaches new people who need to hear it. Remember, domestic violence thrives in silence. Your voice, your courage, your willingness to speak truth to power, that's what breaks the cycle. Be like Amara. Stand in your truth. And never, ever let anyone make you believe you deserve to suffer. Thank you for watching until the end. Stay safe, stay strong, and remember that help is always available. If you or someone you know is experiencing domestic violence, please reach out to the National Domestic Violence. You deserve safety. You deserve love. You deserve justice.